Hello and welcome. Well, we can't say we weren't warned. On World Youth Day in Rio de Janeiro in 2013, Pope Francis, excited by the crowds of young people, adopted something of the energetic creativity of the teenagers he was surrounded by, and he exhorted them to make a mess. He said, "I want to tell you something. What is it that I expect as a consequence of World Youth Day? I want a mess. We knew that in Rio there would be great disorder, but I want trouble in the dioceses. I want to see the church get closer to the people. I want to get rid of clericalism, the mundane, this closing ourselves off within ourselves, in our parishes, schools or structures, because these need to get out." End quote. Well, during the years since, he's put into action himself what he urged the youth in his native South America. And, as he's urged, a mess has followed. But whereas youth create a mess more often by shaking the system with exuberant interrogations, Pope Francis himself has made use of a more subtle method. He's engaged in ambiguity, that is, until the recent Dubia, when the policy changed and the strategy became much more overt. Ambiguity gave way to direct action on homosexual blessings. Well, most people have become aware of the Dubia presented by 5 genuinely disturbed and eminent cardinals. The Vatican most unusually released the text of his first response, and although the form of communication was intended to produce either a yes or a no from the Pope, he wrote more, well, let's say generously. In his generosity, he made a papal pronouncement on the blessing of gay couples. It might not be too much to suggest that he finally broke cover with all the ambiguous hints that went before. It was always going to be a matter of when, not if. Moving from "who am I to judge," he instead gave all clergy permission to judge. He declared his support of homosexual coupledom through the principle of facilitating pastoral blessings. This proposal was in response to the interrogating cardinals asking if the Pope really believed that blessing homosexual unions continued to be, as it always had been, contrary to both the Bible and also the tradition of the Church. But instead of providing the simple yes or no form that the Dubia invites, the Pope explained his thinking, or his resident theologians did. In dealing with people, however, he said, we must not lose the pastoral charity that must permeate all our decisions and attitudes. The defence of the objective truth is not the only expression of this charity, which is also made up of kindness, patience, understanding, tenderness and encouragement. Therefore, we cannot become judges, who am I to judge, who only deny, reject and exclude. For this reason, pastoral prudence must adequately discern whether there are forms of blessing requested of one or more persons that do not transmit a mistaken conception of marriage. For when a blessing is requested, one is expressing a request for help from God, a plea for a better life, a trust in a Father who can help us to live better. Was there any hope that within voluminous paragraphs a slight conceptual sleight of hand might be hidden? But one doesn't have to look very far to follow the technique which was used. When he said objectivity, or in this context, less euphemistically, sexual restraint, objectivity could be contradicted or cancelled by generosity, or in this context, pastorally justified indulgence. But while this may have made a mess of the magisterium, which it did contain an inner coherence. It raises the question as to whether Pope Francis speaks within the confines of the Church's magisterium or outside it. The assumption must be faced that the Pope is consciously breaking with the Church's tradition, but using papal authority, paradoxically, to do it. Archbishop Fernandez said as much when, on his appointment, he emphasised the importance of the charge that had been given to him by Pope Francis, which was to ensure that all Vatican departments are in alignment with the, quote, recent magisterium. What's that? It can happen, he said, that answers are given to certain theological issues without accepting what Francis said that is new on these issues. New? Fernandez said, it's not only inserting a phrase from Pope Francis, but allowing thought to be transfigured by his criteria. This is particularly true for moral and pastoral theology. So then there is intended to be a difference in the Church's moral teaching under Francis, his pastoral criteria. The question for the rest of the Church is whether or not this very energetic attempt to pretend that the theology is consistent when it is in fact inconsistent with the history of the Church is to be taken seriously. The mask or the theological subterfuge lies in the claim that this is all just a development of doctrine, but not a contradiction as it appears. And then the arguments over what constituted development of doctrine, as opposed to the reversal of doctrine. Pope Francis's predecessors were energetic in their condemnation of so-called interpreters of tradition, who sought not to develop, but to reverse it, as people suggest the present Pope is. So in a powerful critique of the modernists, Pope Pius IX wrote this, listen to this. These enemies of divine revelation extol human progress to the skies, and with rash and sacrilegious daring, they would have it introduced into the Catholic religion as if this religion were not the work of God, but of man, or some kind of philosophical discovery, susceptible of perfection by human efforts, end quote. Pope Pius X quoted this, and he extended it in his encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, in 1907. He warned that the spirit of modernism had infiltrated the centre of the Church. He said, the partisans of error are to be sought not only amongst the Church's open enemies, they lie hid, a thing to be deeply deplored and feared, in her very bosom and in her heart, in the ranks of the priesthood itself, feigning a love for the Church, but lacking the firm protection of philosophy and theology, nay more, thoroughly imbued with the poisonous doctrines taught by the enemies of the Church, and lost to all sense of modesty, they vaunt themselves as reformers of the Church, end quote. Well, in several recent remarks, Pope Francis has suggested that there are indeed three areas of reform that the Church has changed its mind about. He refers particularly to slavery, the death penalty, and sexuality as areas in which the Church's understanding has, so-called, developed significantly over the years, in other words, changed. But in fact he's mistaken. This is neither historically nor theologically true. For example, the Church's view on slavery has always remained constant. It has always defined its repudiation of slavery on the defence of the human person being made in the image and the likeness of God. It's never accepted the legitimacy of the practice of the concept, and wherever possible it's done all that it could to mitigate the practice. Some individual people taught differently, but the Church itself hasn't. More interesting is his turning to the example of the death penalty. Father Brian Graebe, Graebe, is a priest in the Archdiocese of New York, and he's recently written in the magazine First Things an excoriating critique of the strategy that Pope Francis has employed in relation to trying to change the significance of the death penalty to what becomes a contradiction rather than a development. So Father Graebe wrote, I'd like to focus on what I believe to be the most serious doctrinal error of this pontificate, which is the change that the Pope made to the Catechism of the Catholic Church regarding the death penalty. I call this the most serious error, both because of its official nature, this wasn't an off-the-cuff remark, and because of the precedent that it set. So what happened? Well, in 2018, Pope Francis completely rewrote the section on the death penalty in the Catechism. He said recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. But today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the human person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure that due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitely deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches in the light of the Gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it's an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. And the Church works with determination for the abolition of the death penalty worldwide. End of Francis's quote. Whilst this didn't overtly contradict the moral teaching of the Church up to that point, the wording in fact renders the death penalty obsolete for the first time, and consequently does so covertly. The practice may not be wrong in theory, but clearly the death penalty is never to be carried out in practice according to the Catechism. And most problematically, asserting that the reason given for this inadmissibility, Francis declares that the current age has become more sensitive. It has a more refined awareness of the dignity of the human person than previous cultures. Really? Can that possibly be true? And this moves neatly and succinctly off the ground of development onto the platform of contradiction. For 2 millennia, the Church believed that capital punishment was, in some cases, morally justified. But now, it appears, we suddenly appreciate human dignity with a deeper sensitivity, concluding that in no circumstances is it justified to the extent that we must work for its complete abolition. But the Pope's emendation to the Catechism was wrong not just in itself, but in giving the impression that it gave. Quote, the Pope changed church teaching was the common takeaway. In fact, the Pope didn't change church teaching. And the question that is now haunting the faithful in the Church is the extent to which he does or doesn't have authority to change church teaching in contradiction but not development. Nonetheless, the impression he can, and he did, remains a terrible problem when it comes to the death penalty. So in response to the recent Dubia, the Pope followed the same course, which enabled him to mandate contradiction whilst asserting it was just development. Well, this presents a challenge to the whole Catholic Church. Invoking the raison d'être of the Catholic Church, continuity and authority, Catholicism is being challenged and changed. The shock of having the ethics and moral values of a defunct liberal Protestantism imposed on the Catholic Church by the Pope may be as great as the shock that is being done in the name of Petrine obedience and the fiction of apostolic continuity, when it is in fact contradiction. So what do we faithful do? We make the Catholic distinction between the holder of the office and the office itself, and we put our trust in God that he will provide us with a faithful shepherd for the Church when this present Pope succumbs to biological entropy. And in the meantime, we're left with a heightened sense of the value of Catholic teaching down the ages. that sex is, in fact, primarily for procreation, and they're making it a tool of pleasure, as same-sex couples must do, and a quest for comfort and intimacy, since there's only sterility, produces an instability and addiction and a disorder to the soul. Because we've watched a secular society succumb to the addiction of sex, and it's been a tragic and a disastrous experiment. Only the Christian teaching, only the power of Christ, only the cleansing and purifying Holy Spirit can hold and defend us from the power of our appetites and remake us in holiness and in the image of Christ. As Catholic laity, we now need to pray for priests and for bishops and even for a pope who understand the Catholic faith as it's always been taught and are willing to live it, not contradict it.